remember when I was growing up, my class went on a day-long field trip to the Art Institute of Minneapolis. It's a wonderful museum if you ever have the chance to go to the Twin Cities. Have any of you ever visited the Art Institute in Minneapolis? A couple of you, yeah. My favorite part of that museum was always the full-scale, period-decorated rooms that were there for us to explore. You could walk through them and see all of the things. And we went around Christmas time every year, and so we would see the Victorian-era salon with the candlelit pine tree and the antebellum dining room with the giant feast laid out on the table. And then, of course, there was the Puritan room, where the big joke was that nothing changed all year long, and that there were no special decorations, no tinsel, just a plain wooden table and a straw-stuffed mattress on a rickety wooden frame and a chamber pot. The Puritans, we were told, were stern and principled, and they considered themselves to be very virtuous. They were trying to purify, thus the term Puritan, purify their society from the frivolity and the corruptions of that Church of England that had gone so awry. In short, boring. At least that's what I thought when we walked through the museum every single year. So it was only years later when I was in seminary that I learned, in fact, that those supposedly dull, fun-hating Puritans were our Unitarian Universalist religious ancestors. Did you know that there are still Unitarian Universalist churches in existence that were founded by the Puritans back in the 1630s and 40s? They're still in existence, and they're still Unitarian, although that name didn't come till quite later. We've got much more in common with them than most Unitarian Universalists know. It's a very long and complex social, religious, political history, but the Cliff Notes version that you need to know for today is this. In the early 1600s, in England, the Reformation was still going strong. The Bible had become available to the people for the first time in English, and people figured out there was some pretty juicy stuff in it. Religion was finally becoming accessible to the masses, not just the church hierarchy and the clergy. So these towns were so excited about it that they convened conversations, they brought in scholars to give lectures in the town square. And what did the Church of England do? They panicked. They shut it down, they made them illegal. And the kings and the bishops conspired together to shore up their power and quash any questioning or dissent. So as you can imagine, lots of folks didn't like this very much. And in the 1630s, about 20,000 English people sailed across the sea to escape the tyranny of the church. They were granted a land charter by the crown, which eventually became the Massachusetts Bay Colony. And I do have to pause here to acknowledge that the land that they arrived in was not a wilderness. It was populated by various groups of indigenous people who were systematically killed and displaced as the British claimed and stole their land. This is a terrible, unavoidable part of our history, yet it is one that we must acknowledge every time we tell this story. But there they were, nonetheless, these 20,000 Brits in an unfamiliar land. And all they had really was a desire for a new society, and more specifically, a new kind of church. They settled in little groups, they made towns, and at first, they didn't really know each other. So they started to have conversations about the kind of society, and more importantly, the kind of church that they wanted to create together. They gathered in people's living rooms, and in barns, and in fields, and they talked it out. But they didn't start with theology. There was no discussion of what sin was or who was going to heaven. They started by writing a covenant. That's not a word that we use very frequently in modern society, covenant, but As I said to the kids earlier, a covenant is very basically a set of promises that a community makes to each other about how they want to be in relationship. And our religious ancestors used the term walking together to describe their covenant. Walking together. It implies friendship, companionship, love, mutual protection. It implies a spiritual journey, side by side, nobody leading ahead or determining the route for the rest of the group. Now, generally, before we got quite as wordy as we are now, these covenants were very brief and simple. We have a record of the earliest one that we know of written in what is now the United States from the Salem Church, which still exists in Salem, Massachusetts. And it goes, "We covenant with the Lord and one another, and do bind ourselves in the presence of God to walk together in all his ways, according as he is pleased to reveal himself unto us in his blessed word of truth." Unitarian Universalist historian Conrad Wright notes that while there are words here with theological significance, Lord, God, it should be remarked that this is not a creedal statement. The operative words here are, "We do bind ourselves to walk together," not "we believe." Their essential function was to make churches out of collections of individuals, to establish community. Our Puritan ancestors got many things wrong, but this concept of the free church, the church in which membership is voluntary and covenantal, and the most important aspect of belonging is not what the members believe, but how they promise to walk together on their spiritual journey. That was central then, and it is still the single most defining characteristic of Unitarian Universalism today. We base our governance and our association of congregations on those concepts of the covenantal free church, first articulated by those early Puritan settlers and then written down in a very important document called the Cambridge Platform, written in 1648. And what they created back then, a system of covenantal association with the big fancy name congregational polity. It is still our guiding organizational structure as Unitarian Universalists. We still hold that each congregation is self-governed, that each congregation has the right to say who its membership is, the right to call and ordain its own ministers, to make its own decisions and bylaws and rules. Each individual's and each congregation's reason and conscience, not a bishop or a synod or a pope, determine the theology and the daily practices of religious life. Congregational polity affirms the place of freedom and independence, but it also demands covenantal interdependence from both individuals and congregations. Alice Blair Wesley, who is a UU minister and an expert on congregational polity, calls this the covenantal organizational pattern of the free church. She says, quote, "It is a doctrine grounded in an understanding of how the power of mutual love deepens and works among individuals in free religious groups that are loyal, above all else, to the spirit of love." In other words, we may not always share a common theology, but we share the conviction that love, above all, is worthy of our work and care. Love is the ordering force of all that we do. That spirit of love, as expressed in our covenants together, is our focus today. As you know, after the service, we will have a discussion about the draft of the Covenant of Right Relations that has been so lovingly and painstakingly prepared by your Healthy Congregations team. I hope you will stay and participate in that conversation. And I want us to go into that meeting sharing a historical perspective on how such a document links us with our religious ancestors from 400 years ago. But I also want us to understand the purpose and the function of a covenant to contemporary Unitarian Universalists, and even more specifically to those of us who are gathered here at Open Circle. When congregations embark on this holy process of developing a covenant, there are always questions about why a covenant is necessary. Aren't the Unitarian Universalist principles and purposes enough? And that's a valid question. Those purposes and principles that we read together are indeed a covenant. And this version of our denominational covenant was developed in the 1980s by a large swath of Unitarian Universalists from around the country. But those purposes and principles are not a covenant for a congregation. They are the covenant of our association of congregations. Did you know that individual people are not members of the Unitarian Universalist Association? That only congregations are members of the UUA? So our principles and purposes are the core values and sources that each congregation covenants to affirm and promote by its existence. They are the covenant of why we exist as a free association of congregations. But the principles and purposes don't explain the how. How will an individual congregation affirm and promote the inherent worth and dignity of every person? How will an individual congregation engage in the democratic process, encourage spiritual growth, or help its members feel connected to that interdependent web of existence of which we are a part? Our congregational polity says that no organization, not even the UUA, can tell each congregation how it will live out those principles. It's up to the individual congregations to do that, to decide how they will incarnate those values among their members and spread them into the larger world. So the how, then, is contained in a covenant designed by the specific community that the covenant binds together. Alice Blair Wesley says, "It is very important to distinguish between the church universal and a particular, concrete, local free church, lest our understanding of the free church become an empty abstraction, a fuzzy ideal bearing no relation to the everyday lives of actual people. Our local church covenant needs to be as clear and explicit as we can make it," she says, "that we may teach it to our children as the reasonable explanation they deserve of why we do the things as we do in this church, and that we may invite others to join us in the making and renewing again and again of our promise of loyalty to the ways of love that matter most in human life, that we might fulfill our promise." And that is exactly what we have here in this beautiful document that has been created by our Healthy Congregations team. They ask the question, how will we live our purposes and principles here at Open Circle? They answer, we will speak and listen carefully, communicate lovingly and directly, cherish, foster, and respect differences in perspective, celebrate each other's contributions, make every effort to reach consensus while achieving solutions we can all live with, and honor the wisdom and spiritual needs of those in the minority as well as those in the majority. By naming the behaviors and the practices that we hope to cultivate, we clarify our expectations of ourselves and of each other. As I discussed with the kids during the Time for All Ages, when we talked about how scary that first day of school is before you know that what behaviors are expected of you and what things you are asked to do to be a part of that community, by being transparent and specific about who we are working to be We let everybody who would be a part of our community know what it means to be a member of this community. You might be thinking, well, that's very nice language, but it's idealistic. Nobody's ever going to actually stick to all of this. And you're not wrong. The practices and behaviors that we name for ourselves in a covenant like this are lofty ideals. I know that I don't live them out every day, and my suspicion is that most of you don't either. But that is the beauty of covenant. Unlike a legal contract, which outlines in great detail the rules and requirements for each party who is bound by it, and then punishes anyone who breaches that agreement, a covenant is aspirational and invitational. One more time. Covenant is aspirational and invitational. It names the highest goals that we have for ourselves as a community. It invites us to behave as our best selves. And it speaks aloud that still small voice of the angels of our better nature. If we can't name, if we can't articulate the kind of relationships we hope to nurture within our walls and out in the greater world, if we can't articulate our farthest reaching vision of the kind of people that we yearn to be, we might as well stay home, alone. By naming our aspirations aloud and covenanting with one another to live them out to the best of our ability, we take ownership of our community. We invest in a future that we want to be a part of. We hold ourselves and each other in fierce and deeply loving accountability. We affirm that what we could be together with attention and intention is greater than the sum of our individual parts. And because that vision is larger than what we now are, and larger than any of us could ever be by ourselves, it is precious. It is so precious that even when we fall short of our best selves, the promise of what we could be, the promise of what we want to create together, it embraces us, it holds us, and it encourages us to pick ourselves up, dust off our knees, say we're sorry when we need to, and move along, walking forward together. There is no mistake, no bad behavior, no hurt, or no wrong that is worth forsaking an end goal of such worth. As I sang in our call to worship this morning in the words of the poet Rumi, though you've broken your vows 1,000 times, come, yet again, come. A covenant is not just written words on a piece of paper. It is the living, breathing, incarnated spiritual practice of creating community. The document that we'll discuss in a few minutes is beautifully crafted. It is lovingly composed, and it is a description of that spiritual practice. But it is two-dimensional. So while the words that it contains are important, I invite all of us to recognize that this is not about semantics, but about invitation and aspiration. All of us are being invited today to engage with one another in new, more honest, more compassionate, more accountable ways. This covenant will not change individual people. It will not provide personality transplants. But it does ask us to consider what we might do, how we might engage so that we are better able to be in relationship with even those people who are vastly different than us, those who we might desire to put on the donor list. This covenant asks all of us to respond in new ways when we disagree, when someone hurts us or angers us, or when someone gets mad at us. It's not about niceness or politeness or avoidance of conflict. It's about committing to and actually practicing relationship that is deep and hard, and in the end, the only thing that is worth living for. Covenant does not demand that we like each other, but it requires that we love each other. What holds us together as Unitarian Universalists today, as much as 400 years ago, is not what we believe in common. It is the values and relationships that we want to create as the foundation of our spiritual and community life together. And the gracious, forgiving, challenging, and deeply loving circle of our covenant draws us together again and again to engage in that holy work. It calls us to walk together. May we be loving companions to one another on the journey. May it be so. Blessed be Ashe and Amen.